I remember the weight of the chair beneath me and the way the crystal lights blurred when I realized I couldn't see my own daughter's face. The room smelled like roses and champagne, but all I could hear was the low hum of celebration happening somewhere beyond the wall of flowers placed deliberately in front of me. I sat there smiling, hands folded, feeling myself quietly erased in plain sight. If you've ever felt underestimated or pushed aside when you least expected it, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Moments like this happen more often than people admit. I told myself it was a mistake, a seating mix-up, nothing personal. But as I watched certain eyes pass over me and linger elsewhere, a cold understanding crept in. This wasn't carelessness, it was judgment. I didn't know it then. But that silent insult was the first move in a much larger game. That was the moment everything started to unravel. I was seated at the wedding where I could barely see my own daughter get married. Table 12, tucked behind a towering wall of flowers, so dense it blocked the altar and most of the room. From that chair, I watched the celebration through reflections and gaps, like an afterthought carefully placed out of sight. I am Claire Bennett, a widow in her 70s, and that afternoon I wore my quiet grief the way I always do, neatly pressed and unobtrusive. I told myself the placement was a mistake, a rushed oversight in a room buzzing with planners, servers, and expectations. Still, the sting settled deep. I felt reduced, evaluated, filed away. As guests arrived, I noticed how attention flowed. Certain people were greeted warmly, drawn into circles near the front. Others, like me, were acknowledged politely, then bypassed. I studied faces, postures, the way some eyes skimmed past me and moved on. One man, confident and polished, scanned the room with purpose, measuring value with a smile that never reached his eyes, sitting there, half hidden. I understood something important. This wasn't forgetfulness or poor planning. It was a quiet test. I was being placed where I could be observed without being heard, underestimated by design. And as I folded my hands and lowered my gaze, I realized why. I learned early that people see what you give them permission to see. After my husband died, I stepped into a smaller life without protest. I wore simple clothes, drove the same car, kept my routines predictable. Grief taught me restraint, but habit taught me usefulness. I let the world believe I was fragile. A quiet widow who clipped coupons, worried about heating bills, and spent evenings rereading old letters. None of that was a lie. But it was not the whole truth either. Modesty became a language I spoke fluently, one that asked nothing and threatened no one. Being underestimated was not new to me. It happened at banks, in waiting rooms, in conversations where people spoke over me instead of to me. At first it hurt. Then I noticed something else. When people stop watching closely, they reveal themselves. When they assume you are harmless, they lower their guard. I lived carefully after my loss, not because I was afraid, but because quiet creates space to think. I listened more than I spoke. I observed patterns, tone, intent. Invisibility can be a kind of shelter if you know how to use it. So I stayed small on purpose. I let grief soften my edges and simplicity blur my outline. Others learned to see only what I allowed, and that misunderstanding opened the door to what came next afterward. I noticed him before he noticed me, which told me everything I needed to know. He approached with the confidence of someone who believed he belonged everywhere, his attention landing on me like a favor. The warmth felt practiced, generous in a way that asked for gratitude. At first, it sounded like concern, curiosity about how I was managing on my own, admiration for my resilience, gentle questions wrapped in compliments. On the surface, it was kindness. Underneath, my instincts stirred. The focus wasn't on who I was, but on what I lacked. I felt him testing the edges, measuring how much I knew, how much I depended on others, how easily I might be guided. He spoke in solutions before I mentioned problems, in reassurance before I expressed worry. That imbalance was deliberate. Care offered too quickly is rarely care at all. I stayed pleasant. I stayed small. Outwardly, I matched the role he expected, nodding, listening, appearing grateful. Inside, I cataloged every detail. The rhythm of his concern, the subtle urgency, the way control hid behind courtesy. I have learned that predators announce themselves quietly. They frame dominance as help and authority as protection. When they believe you are weak, they move closer. By then, my curiosity had shifted fully into caution, and caution had already begun shaping a plan of my own, quietly, carefully. So when the suggestion of a private dinner surfaced, framed as generosity and family bonding, I agreed without hesitation. Not because I trusted him, but because I wanted to hear what came next. I arrived early, as invited, to a restaurant chosen for its quiet power. Linen tablecloths, low lighting, a view meant to impress. It was the kind of place where decisions feel heavier simply because of the setting. I understood immediately that this dinner was not about connection, it was about leverage. As the meal unfolded, the tone shifted. What had been framed as support began to carry urgency. I sensed pressure wrapped in reassurance, solutions presented before consent was ever considered. My independence was spoken of like a problem to be fixed, my age like a risk to be managed. Inside, my alarm grew louder. Each mention of paperwork, accounts, future planning translated clearly in my mind. Control, access, authority. I felt anger rise, slow and steady, not explosive but clarifying. This was not generosity, it was acquisition. I noticed how little space there was for my perspective, how quickly timelines were suggested, how calm certainty replaced courtesy. He wanted momentum, not understanding. He wanted me compliant, not informed. Outwardly, I remained composed. Years of restraint served me well. I nodded, listened, asked for time. Not because I was unsure, but because I was certain. Confrontation would have satisfied him. Delay unsettled him. By the time dessert arrived, I no longer questioned my instincts. This was calculated, rehearsed, and intentional. The dinner was a test of how easily I could be cornered. As I left, one truth settled firmly in me. He had no idea who he was dealing with, and the advantage he thought he held was about to change. That realization steadied me, reminding me that patience, when chosen deliberately, can quietly shift power back to me again. After that dinner, I did not sleep much. Not from fear, but from clarity. I sat at my kitchen table before sunrise, the house quiet, and I let the truth settle. He believed he had discovered something fragile. He was wrong. There was a part of my life I never discussed, not with family, not with friends, and certainly not with him. Years earlier, loss had taught me to prepare instead of react. I learned to put safeguards in place while no one was paying attention. I learned that privacy is not secrecy, and silence is not surrender. What looked like restraint was discipline. What sounded like hesitation was calculation. I had made choices slowly, deliberately, guided by the understanding that independence must be protected long before it is threatened. That preparation did not come from suspicion, it came from responsibility. Sitting there in the dim morning light, I felt steady, not angry, not rushed, just resolved. I understood that power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. I did not need to confront him or reveal anything. Doing so would have shifted the game in his favor. Instead, I chose patience. I chose to let him continue believing the story he had written about me. From that moment on, every nod, every agreement, every moment of apparent compliance would serve a purpose. I had decided to move forward carefully, allowing him to feel confident, victorious, while I planned. Once I understood what he was trying to do, my first instinct was to push back. Everything in me wanted to draw a line, to name the behavior for what it was and shut it down immediately. But instinct is loud, and strategy is quiet. I chose quiet. I began to respond the way he expected me to. I slowed my speech. I asked careful questions that sounded uncertain. I allowed pauses to stretch, let him fill the space with explanations and reassurances. Outwardly, I appeared overwhelmed, grateful even. Inside, I was measuring every move. Pretending weakness is harder than resisting openly. It requires discipline to swallow words you know would change the room. There were moments it felt humiliating, moments when I had to remind myself why I was doing this. I was not yielding. I was waiting. I watched how confidence grew in him as my resistance disappeared, how quickly patience turned into assumption. He began to move faster, to plan ahead, convinced the path was clear. That certainty told me everything. People reveal the most when they think they have already won. Beneath the surface, I stayed alert. I noted timing, patterns, and pressure points. I kept my routines unchanged, my demeanor consistent. Calm became my shield. By then, the emotional strain was real, but so was my resolve. I committed fully to the role he had cast me in. I let him believe he was in control, because I knew the moment that illusion shattered, everything would change. I walked into the final meeting expecting calm, and that was exactly what I gave him. The room felt ordinary, almost dull, which made his confidence louder than words. He believed the outcome was settled. I could feel it in the way he relaxed, in how carefully he stopped pretending. As the moments passed, his restraint slipped. What had once been framed as guidance hardened into entitlement. His attention narrowed, fixed on what he thought he was about to secure. Greed has a sound when you listen closely. It rushes, it assumes, it forgets caution. I stayed steady. Years of waiting had prepared me for this exact instant. I watched as certainty turned into excess, as he pushed just far enough to reveal himself completely. There was no ambiguity left. The mask did not crack. It fell. The shift was immediate. Control drained from him as quickly as it had inflated. His confidence collapsed inward, replaced by confusion he could not hide. In that quiet reversal, I felt no need to react. Justice does not always require force. Sometimes it arrives through exposure alone. I noticed how small he suddenly seemed, stripped of the narrative he had built. I did not feel triumph so much as relief. The danger was over. The game had ended. When it was done, I sat with the stillness that followed. The room felt different, lighter somehow. I understood then that patience had done its work. What he tried to take from me was gone, and what remained was mine to keep. I breathed deeply, accepting that silence, dignity, and preparation had protected me better than anger ever could. And that understanding would guide every step I took from that day forward with quiet confidence. After everything ended, there was a long stillness that followed me home. Not relief exactly, but space. In that quiet, the truth of what had protected me began to surface fully. Years before any of this, my husband and I had talked about preparation the way other couples talked about vacations. He believed love meant planning for storms you hoped would never come. when he was gone. I honored that belief. I did not rush. I put pieces in place slowly, guided by trust and memory. What looked like luck was never luck. It was patience, layered over time. It was decisions made when no one was watching, safeguards shaped by responsibility, not fear. Sitting there afterward, I felt his presence in that outcome, steady and unseen. The confrontation did not create safety. It revealed it. I understood then that this moment was not about one man's greed or one narrow victory. It was about honoring a life built carefully, about carrying forward lessons meant to protect more than just me. Relief softened into gratitude, and gratitude into resolve. Because when truth comes out, it never stops with the person who forced it into the open. It ripples outward. As I gathered myself, I realized the story was no longer only mine. Others would feel the impact of what had been uncovered, and responsibility now walked beside security. That understanding settled heavily, preparing me for the consequences that would follow. I knew those consequences would test my compassion, my boundaries, and my strength in ways I had not yet imagined. Truth never lands quietly. When everything surfaced, the first faces I thought of were not his, but my daughter's. The aftermath reached our family before it reached the outside world. She struggled in ways that hurt to witness. Confusion mixed with grief as she tried to reconcile the man she trusted with the reality now exposed. I saw the ground shift beneath her, and I felt the familiar pull of guilt. A mother wants to shield her child from pain, even when that pain carries a lesson. I questioned myself in long, silent moments. Could I have stopped this sooner? Could I have spared her the shock? But honesty demanded an answer I did not like. Protection delayed is not protection at all. Allowing manipulation to continue would have cost her far more in the end. Setting boundaries was not an act of punishment. It was an act of preservation. I stayed present without rescuing her from the truth. I listened without rewriting what had happened. That balance was harder than confrontation ever was. I came to understand that damage from manipulation is not limited to money or power. It fractures trust, reshapes relationships, and forces reckonings no one asks for. Innocent people are pulled into storms they did not create. In time, I saw something change in my daughter. Pain sharpened into clarity. She began asking different questions, standing more firmly in her own decisions. Watching that shift reminded me why this mattered. Loss had opened a door forward. After the chaos faded, I realized that simply surviving was not enough. Safety without meaning leaves a quiet emptiness, and I felt it settling in once the noise stopped. I needed to decide what this experience would become. I spent time reclaiming boundaries I had let blur for the sake of peace. I trusted my instincts again, honored my limits, and accepted that caution is not cynicism. Those lessons were costly, but they were mine, earned honestly, and kept with care. Healing began privately, but it could not stay there. I saw how easily others could be misled by confidence dressed as concern. I recognized the same vulnerabilities I once carried, and I understood that silence would turn hard, won clarity into waste. Responsibility followed awareness. I chose meaning over bitterness, not forgiveness without accountability, and not anger without direction. Purpose gave the pain somewhere to go. It allowed me to stand firmly without hardening, to protect without controlling, to speak without needing applause. My sense of self rebuilt itself around truth and self-trust. I no longer needed to appear small to feel safe. I no longer confused politeness with obligation. What remained was steadier, quieter, and stronger than before. Moving forward, I carry intention instead of fear. I pay attention. I ask better questions. I leave room for wisdom to grow. What happened to me did not define my ending, but it clarified my path, and that clarity would soon shape the lesson I needed to share. That lesson centers on vigilance, compassion, and choice, reminding me that strength matures when guided by conscience. It asks me to stay open, prepared, and accountable, using experience to serve, not dominate, and to move through life awake, steady, and willing to protect dignity wherever I find it with patience and quiet resolve. When everything finally settled, what remained was not anger, but clarity. Distance has a way of softening the noise and sharpening the truth. Looking back, I can see how much of this began long before the confrontation. In the moments I ignored my own discomfort to keep the peace, I learned how expensive politeness can be when it asks you to betray your instincts. The warning signs were there, quiet but persistent. I felt them in my body before I could name them in my mind. Ignoring those signals did not make me kind, it made me vulnerable. Boundaries are not walls built out of fear. They are lines drawn in self-respect. I understand now that saying no early is often the most compassionate choice, for yourself and for others. Accountability does not require cruelty, but it does require firmness, strength. I have learned is not about reacting loudly in moments of crisis. It is about preparing quietly long before one arrives. It is about listening, observing, and trusting yourself even when others underestimate you. Dignity grows in those quiet decisions no one applauds. This journey took me from humiliation to agency, from silence to intention. It reminded me that discernment is a form of care, and that self-trust must be practiced to survive pressure. These lessons extend far beyond my story. They belong to anyone who has ever felt dismissed, tested, or quietly evaluated. If you are listening to this, thank you for staying with me through it. Sharing this was not easy, but it felt necessary. If you have faced something similar, or if this stirred a memory or question in you, I would like to hear it. Tell me in the comments. I read everyone, and your story matters too. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. Sharing it felt like setting something down that I carried quietly for a long time, and your presence here matters more than you know. If there is one feeling I hope remains, it is this. You are allowed to trust yourself. Your instincts, your boundaries, your quiet doubts all deserve attention. Strength does not always look loud or dramatic. Sometimes it looks like patience, preparation, and the courage to wait. As you sit with this, I invite you to reflect on your own experiences. Have you ever been underestimated or felt pressure to stay polite when something felt wrong? If this story connected with you, please share your thoughts in the comments. I read every message, and I value the honesty people bring here. We are not alone in these lessons. Thank you for listening and being here.